Hi there, I'm Eitan, and welcome back to the Wix Wiz. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to retrieve data from a Google Sheet and then display it in a repeater on a Wix website. So if you want to learn how to do that and more, let's get started. Okay, so before we get started writing out some code, let me just go over what the initial setup is and what our starting point is going to be. So I'm going to be assuming in this video that you have already set up the Velo Google Sheets integration. So that's what you see over here in public backend. You'll see I have a file here called Google Sheets, and I've already built out all these functions which use the Velo Google Sheets integration in order to retrieve data from my sheet, which I have set up right over here, and it's called mock data. In addition, I have created the necessary credentials on the Google developers website, and I've stored them here in the secrets manager in order to retrieve data from my Google Sheet. So if you haven't done that or don't know how to do that, then you might want to check out the other video that I have, which is a general introduction to using Google Sheets with Wix, and that will go into detail about all of those different things and how to set them up. In that example, what we did is we built this table, which you see here, which is essentially displaying the same data that I have over here inside of my mock data Google Sheet. Okay, so you see here ID1, Barry, Yuri, etc. And that is the same thing that is displaying here inside of my table. In this video, we'll be talking about how to take the Google Sheet data and display it using a different Wix element, which is a repeater. So again, we're not going to be talking about how to get the data from the Google Sheet, but just what to do from the point where you have the data from the Google Sheet and you want to display it inside of a repeater. Okay, so here I am on a new page where we're going to be setting up this repeater connection. And for the purpose of the demonstration, I've set up a very, very simple repeater element. In my repeater element, I have two text boxes. One is going to be for the name and the other for the email. And I've also added another element, which is a image that will hopefully display the image that we have over here for these first three entries in the mock data Google Excel sheet. Okay, so that is what we're going to be trying to do. And first things first, let's go ahead and start setting up the on item ready for our repeater. So I'm going to pop into the code right over here. And I am going to start off by naming things in our repeater. So here, let me select the repeater first, and I'm going to call this mock data repeater. And then I'll select the name element and I'll call it name. And I'll select the email element and I'll call it email. And then I will also select the image. Might need to scroll out a bit to do that. Select the image and I'll just call it plain old image. Not very sophisticated naming, but it will do the trick. And then over here, I am going to select our repeater. So this is going to be mock data repeater dot on item ready. And here we're going to have item and item data. What I'm doing now is very simple repeater setup. So if you're not sure about how to use repeaters in general, then I do recommend checking out some of my other tutorials which go in depth about explaining how to use repeaters. So I'm going to assume that you have some familiarity and you basically understand what I'm doing here. So now that we've set up the on item ready, I'm going to select the specific elements within the repeater. So that will be our name, and it will be our email, and it will be our image. So item, image. And each one of these we're going to attribute to certain data from the item. So let's say .name text should be equal to item data .name, and email should be equal to item data .email. Don't forget the equal sign. And the image.source will be equal to item data .image. Okay, so that was the easy part, and now comes the part where we actually are going to be integrating with Google Sheets. So what we want to do next is we want to retrieve the data from our Google Sheet, and we want to format it in a way that it will be able to be passed as data to the repeater. So let's start off by retrieving data from our Google Sheet. And in order to do that, let's just peek back at the code from the previous tutorial where we fetched the data and we displayed it in a table. So what we did here is we got the data by calling await get values from Google Sheets. So that's a backend function that's over here in the Google Sheets folder, file, sorry. And what we needed to pass in was the range of the indexes, I think that's what they're called, the range of columns and rows that we are going to be fetching from the mock data Google Sheet. So essentially it's from A1, and in this example what we did was until E16, so that would be down until about here, E16. So in this demonstration, what we're going to want to do, I'm just going to want to try and fetch these first three. So that's essentially going to be from A1 until G4. Okay, so that's what I'm going to be fetching over here. So let me just copy over this line of code, and I'm going to go to our Google Sheets repeater page, and I'm going to use that same function that we have over here. And at the moment we have a lot of red going on, so let's fix that. First of all, we have to import this function. Okay, so this function needs to be imported from the backend. So I'm importing this from backend slash Google Sheets. Okay, that's this file that we have right over here, backend Google Sheets. And here we have await, which means this is an asynchronous, this needs to be placed in an asynchronous function. So what I'll do is I'm going to create a function, and I'm going to call it populate repeater data. And here we don't need any parameters. And I'm going to take all of this that I'm doing here now and put it inside of this function. And I'm going to turn it into an asynchronous function. And then what I'll do here is call that function as soon as we load the page. And I'm doing it now because otherwise I'll forget to do it at the end. Okay, so once we have this data, first I'm going to change this here. We said we want to do A1 until G4. So let me just change that here. So this is going to be, instead of E16, I'm going to change this to G4. And now what I want to do is I want to see what this data looks like once we get it. Okay, so I'm going to say here console.log data. And now I'm going to go into preview mode. And I want to see what that data looks like because we're going to need to take it from whatever structure we get it in and turn it into data that will be good for our repeater. So here's the data that we got. So I see here that we have data, and then under that we have another property called data, and then we have our values, which is essentially an array. And each item in the array corresponds to a row inside of our Excel sheet. Okay, so, oops, sorry about that. So here the first one will always be our headers, okay? And then after that, we'll have our lines of data. So here what we're going to do is I'm going to assume we could do one of two things. Either I can assume that I know what each column is and determine the data according to that, or I can use the names of my columns in order to determine what their properties will be called in the new object that I'll be constructing. And if that wasn't understandable to you at all, that's totally fine. And you just continue watching and I'll show you exactly what I mean. So now that we got the raw data from the Google Sheet and we kind of understand how it's built, what we're going to do is start extracting the data that we want and changing the format to fit a repeater. So first, let's start off with extracting the data. So we wanted the values part of this data that came back. So if you remember, it was data.data and then values. So I'm going to say here that const values should be equal to data.data. And this should give us just that array with the information from the Google Sheet. Now that we have those values, I want to split it into two variables. One variable is going to be for just the header, and the other is going to be for all the other rows. Okay, so I want to separate that out into two different things. So I'm going to say here that const header should be equal to values 0. Okay, so the first row of the headers. And I'm going to use slice in order to get the rest of the array. So I'm going to say const, let's call it rows equals to values dot slice. And here we're going to start from 1. Okay, and this should give us separate the headers and the rows. Let's add here console.log header and rows just to check that out. So I'm going to go here into preview mode. And let's see what we have here. Okay, so I have one array that's just my headers, and I have another array which is my 3 rows, and if there were more rows it would go on and continue. So there we go, we split everything into 2. And now what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to iterate between these different rows and construct each one so that instead of being an array, it'll actually be an object. And this object will have properties like first name, last name, email, etc. And it will have values, which will be these values from the array. Okay, and if to do that, we're going to head back to the editor, and I'm going to say that rows dot for each, and here we're going to have row. What we're going to do is we are going to iterate inside of that row. So essentially we're going to have another loop inside of here, and we're going to say that row dot for each, and here we can say column within that row. We're going to do something. And before we do that thing, let's set up the final array, which is going to be for our repeater data. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say const repeater data equals to an empty array. And then each new item that we construct will go into this repeater data. And for each row, we're also going to have a new repeater item, okay, which is going to be an empty object initially. Okay, and now that we have this empty object, we're going to take each column, so each value from each row, and we're going to assign it a corresponding header as the property. So what we can do here is we can tap into the index property of the for each, and we can say that repeater item, repeater item, and then we can say index, sorry, not index. We can say headers, sorry, this should be headers in plural, headers, and then here we're going to have index, and we can say that that should be equal to column. Okay, so essentially what we're doing is we're saying that this object over here should have a property, that the property value is equal to the value of headers at this index. So for 0, it will be, it should be ID, and then for 1, it should be first name, and then last name, etc. And that should be equal to this column value that we have in the row. And after we get each one of these repeater items, what we're going to do is we're going to say repeater data.push repeater item. And then here at the very end, after everything, I'm going to add here console.log repeater data. And what I want to do is I want to add some more console logs here along the way just to explain what we did and possibly catch any mistakes that I made in the code. So here, after this, let's say here, I'll say console.log, and I'll log the index, I'll log the headers index, and I'll log the column, just so you can see what's going on here. And let's go ahead and go into preview mode and see what this all looks like. Okay, so you can see here how it's working. Okay, so inside of the first row, so our index is 0, the header is ID, and the value, the column, will be 1. And then the same thing again for the next item, and the same thing again for the next item. And what this does is essentially gives us an array with with objects as items, and you'll see here that the properties of this object are equal to our header. Okay, and then we can basically just use these in order to tap into our data and populate the repeater. There's only one thing that we have to change, and that is that we need to add an ID value, and not plain ID, but underscore ID, that will be unique for each item and will be a string. Okay, because that's a rule of repeaters. If you recall, that every item inside of the repeater has to have a unique ID that is a string. So let's go back to the editor and set that up. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use these IDs that we have over here. Okay, so if you have IDs inside of your Google Sheet, then awesome. If not, you can either generate a random number or use a UUID package, which I decided just now that I'm actually going to show you how to do, because chances are, high chances you don't have any kind of unique ID inside of your Google Sheet, and I want to show you a generic way that will work for everyone. So let's go over here and I'll add the npm package, which is called UUID, and basically it just generates a random string ID. And you'll notice that they're actually very similar to the IDs that Wix assigns to its own internal data collections and stuff like that. And that has to do with how it's generated and its uniqueness as an ID, to put it in a nutshell. So once that's installed for us, we can go ahead and import it inside of our front-end code. Okay, so here you have a README with some instructions, and I'm going to use the version 4, so I'm just going to copy this over. And here at the top of my code, I'm going to import version 4 as UUID v4, and we're going to use that to generate the random IDs. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say const repeater data with IDs equals to repeater data dot map, and for each item we're going to spread in the original item, and we're going to add the ID property, and it's going to be a UUID v4. So you just call it like that, like it's a function, and that'll add in the random ID. And then once we have this data, we can assign it to our repeater. Repeater mock data repeater dot data equals to repeater data with IDs. Awesome. And one small thing that we're going to have to change is that here we said that name should be equal to item data.name, but you'll recall that we don't have any properties called just name because we don't have a column that's called just name, or a header. So I'm going to combine last name and first name in order to create that. So let's go over here, and here instead of item data.name, I'm actually going to create a template literal. And here we'll have item data dot first name, and then space, and very similar, but just with last name. and then we can test it out. The only thing which I'm not sure will work is the images, because I didn't check what kind of data that actually has. So let's see if that works for us. Okay, so let's go ahead and go into preview mode. I'm enjoying this tutorial where I don't have to publish the website at all. Awesome, so this is not working, which is always nice. Oh, there we go. Okay, it just took a second for the data to come in. Why am I so pessimistic? Okay, so yeah, so you see here that the data came in and it's populating. So our first names and last names are working. I don't see here I don't see the images. And I'm trying to think if that's because maybe I didn't select G4. We can close this. We don't need this anymore. Let me go back to the editor and see here A1 to G4. Let me just add here again console.log data to see the data that came back. Go back into preview mode. Config data values image. Okay, that's number 6. Yeah, but for some reason the images are not coming back along with the data. So bad news for the people who want to have images inside of their Google Sheet. It does not seem like the images, the data of the images comes back. I remember that this was asked, I think, in a comment on a previous video, which is why I wanted to take a look into it. But it seems like if you have an image just kind of sitting like this inside of your Google Sheet, as far as I can tell, it will not import along with this. So what you could do instead is, instead of having the image directly in your Google Sheet, you can instead use a URL to the image, let's say, and put that over here, and then you can use that in order to be the source for the image in your repeater. But otherwise, what we did was rather successful. The only thing I would probably change is to initially collapse the repeater. So let's have this repeater as collapsed. And then after I assign the data to the repeater, I'll expand it. And that's just so that you don't see that kind of flash of a repeater with no data, which makes it look like either something broken or I don't know what. So let's go into preview mode. Great, no repeater, the data is being retrieved, and boom, it comes in. So we're going to wrap up here. That's how you would get data from a Google Sheet and use it to populate a repeater. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe. If you have any follow-up questions, any other related videos you'd like to see, feel free to leave those in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.